This offseason, Andrew Berry has gotten a lot of well-deserved praise for bringing in Jadeveon Clowney, for being aggressive and overhauling the secondary, for being patient / aggressive enough to get a guy like JOK in the second round of the draft. Overall, this has been a pretty positive offseason for the perception of Andrew Berry thus far in his young career as a GM. The one move, though, that has been, I would say, at least a little bit controversial has been the move to release Sheldon Richardson. Now, a lot of people, I feel like, were kind of reserving their opinion or reserving speaking their opinion about this move just because it was heavily kind of floated out there by a lot of people that Sheldon Richardson could come back to the Browns on a lesser deal and that this was kind of a big negotiating tactic by the team. But now that Sheldon Richardson has signed with Minnesota for about like $3.5 million in 1 year, basically the same money that they gave Takk McKinley. I think that makes it pretty clear that the Browns cut Sheldon Richardson. They really had no plans to keep him after they cut him if they weren't willing to bring him in for the same money. They got everybody else here on these prove-it deals. So since that is the case, I think it's fair and it's about the time to evaluate this question. And that question is, will the Browns regret not keeping Sheldon Richardson? We're going to evaluate this move. We're going to discuss why it happened, and we're going to discuss what the Browns' plans are to replace him and if those plans are sufficient enough. But before I get into that, I want to make sure I give a shout out to the patreon.com dog check tier members. And I'm going to start with Fred Pratt III, David Vautier, Relentless Buck, Chunt, Rex Kaufman, The Real Quincy Carrier, Kevin Johnson, Marino V, Cleveland Cart, Matt H, Sign Sheets, Gemini, Fight Dirty 74, Yo-Yo, Matt Lloyd, Paul Wilcox, Hundo Magnifico, Rob Ferron, Kyle Stouffer, Lukey from Munich, Dave Roth, J Guy 101, Joe Bobby, Brad Cowbo, Dylan W, James McGinley, Arenda Hall, Chad Gimme, David Maldonado, Dylan Hale, Josh Bendor, Mark M, TJ Showman, Stuart Moore, Cleveland BCI, Robert Jermaine Jr., Dave Mike May, John Cummings, Andrew Hirsch, Curtis Bear, Brock Kumar, John Albert, Masayua, Buds Roland, James Nemo, Mac House, Reeve Hertz, Philip Wilcoxon, Marie Vivert, Sean Barron, Goggles Pisano, Corporal Nick Lopez, Dom Gazzulo, Nick Nasty, Ian Whitaker, Colin 216, Anthony Latham, Christian, Dave Strong, Matt Stone, Charles Work, Billy Moose Gentry, Mark Burnett II, Andre Griffin, Otis Wolf, Dog Pound Kai, Greg Ehlers, Austin Bolin, Kirkabar, Easley Badge, Joe Hart, Warren Ash, Tyler Chiz, John Kessel, J. Gabriel Wilson, Max Nilikinko, Lydia Mahawk, Jesus Serrano, Chris Phones, Picktown Browns backers, Mark Kahn, Max Owl Dojo, and Water Bear Marketing. Again, guys, thank you so much for your support on Patreon, YouTube, Twitter, wherever it is that you give the support. I appreciate it. Now let's talk about this Sheldon Richardson move, and is this one that the Browns are going to regret in the long run? Now, the Sheldon Richardson move is a very interesting one, right? If you're just looking at this from a pure numbers perspective, there is a clear argument you can make for why the Browns didn't keep him. Sheldon was making about $12 million a year. Yes, he was good, but he wasn't super productive, and he was starting to age up there towards 30, and you can argue that the production started to dip a couple of years ago. But since football doesn't exist in a numbers vacuum, there are other things that kind of have to go in place. Sheldon was more of a sentimental favorite of the fan base for good reason, right? Sheldon was one of the first people to sign here in Cleveland long term when the rebuild was first getting started off. Him, Jarvis Landry are kind of the OGs when it comes to free agents or free agent type players that had to make a commitment to this team and this franchise early on, long term. They took a risk, and it was nice to see that it was paying out. Also, Sheldon, you know, on his mic'd up videos, he's very fun. He's a very inviting guy. He's also a veteran, a guy who's been a locker room leader, somebody who's been a fun presence around Myles Garrett. There's a lot of good and human reason why, you know, the cutting of Sheldon Richardson might not be something that sits as well if you're just looking at this thing on paper. And one of the things I like to say with team sports is that part of it, right? When we talk about analytics, when we talk about the numbers, like, yes, those are important, but also the human part, the personality part, that part's also very important. So these aren't things that are diminishable. These are real things that Sheldon does bring to the table outside of his ability to play on the field. So I think that has created kind of an interesting juxtaposition where this was more of an analytic move, where, the people move would have been just to keep Sheldon Richardson at least for this year, then cut him after that when his deal would have had no guaranteed money. So that's where we're at with the whole Sheldon Richardson debate and where people are on either side of it. Now, why was this done? In my opinion, I think it's pretty clear what the Browns are going for and the reason that they're going with this. One, I think they made a decision at the end of the year that they weren't really happy with the interior defensive line play for the last couple of years. And why I say that's a little obvious is because, the two main defensive linemen in the inside aren't back, right? Larry Ogunjobi, they let walk without really negotiating anything with, and they cut Sheldon Richardson and didn't really attempt to bring him back in any serious way that would have been compelling to Sheldon Richardson. And it is fair to say that the interior defensive line play, even with Sheldon Richardson, has been disappointing at times, and if not a lot. I think the injuries and everything that happened in the back end kind of took focus away from what had been a big problem in the center of this defensive line, but nonetheless, it was still a big vulnerability that this team had, was the inability to stop runs up the middle, right? You talk about teams like Washington, who had 103 yards against the Browns, one of the worst running teams in football. Jacksonville had 140, one of the worst running teams in football. Pittsburgh, who you could argue was the worst running team in football, they averaged about 84 yards a game during the regular season against everybody else. Against Cleveland, 107. So the run defense was an issue, and if you look at the run direction stats for what those teams did, they just spammed the run up the middle because the Browns couldn't really do anything to stop that because, again, they just weren't strong enough up front. Now, I felt like, personally, Sheldon could have been a workable part of that solution. I thought the one part that just didn't mix anymore, that they had to move on from and find a different player to fill that role, was Larry Ogunjobi, just because he doesn't fit, not because he's not good. And I felt like Sheldon was a more workable part of that solution. Obviously, they either disagree or they don't think Sheldon is a pivotal part to that solution and that they can fix this problem without having Sheldon Richardson on the books. And again, 30 years old, $12 million. You can make sense of it from an analytical point of view. Yeah, while the money's there and the money's always going to be the excuse that people go with for why you would cut a player, I don't really think the cap was the issue. I think they had enough cap space. They really are good at structuring these deals and making sure that they have rollover cap, even when they sign a ridiculous amount of free agents. I don't think the cap was the issue here. And again, if the cap was the issue, they would have brought him back at a $3.5 million number. They didn't choose to do that. So if the money doesn't seem like it's the real reason the Browns cut Sheldon Richardson, why did they do it? And I think the biggest reason the Browns did this is they have some defensive tackle investments that they want to get on the field and get a lot of playing time. Now, we knew Andrew Billings, the free agent signing from last year, he was going to take a bigger role this year. That was kind of obvious, but the Browns also signed Malik Jackson, who they feel like can fill a similar role to Sheldon Richardson. But more importantly, last year they drafted Jordan Elliott. The year after that, they've drafted Tommy Togiai. They've brought in Malik McDowell, a former second-round pick. Marvin Wilson, a guy who was projected to be a first- or second-round pick a year before this year's draft. You have priority rookie free agent guys that you have on the roster. You have guys that you've drafted that you need to get playing time. And I think all of that in the Browns front office eyes, I think to them created a need to make a vacuum at that defensive tackle position in order to get some of these younger guys into the rotation and get them real playing time, to see what you have with them and to see if these are going to be long-term solutions. Because even if Billings and Malik Jackson work out this year, they're not going to be guaranteed to come back to the team next year because they're both on one-year deals. So the Browns need to find some long-term solutions in the interior of that defensive line. And I think their long-term solution is going to be Tommy Togiai with Jordan Elliott. I think that's what they hope. or it might be Marvin Wilson with Jordan Elliott, or any combination of the young guys that they have on the roster. Those are where they're planning. That's where they're planning long term. And I think that's what this move was more about. This was a move more about the long term development of that defensive tackle position rather than it being about money or it being about the level of play there. So I think this was more about that, in my opinion. I also think that you can make a good argument for this being the right time to take a risk and see what you have in younger players, because you do have this safety blanket, right, of a Malik Jackson. You do have the safety blanket of Miles and Clowney helping out inside if things kind of get shaky there. So you have a lot of safety blankets there for these young players that don't necessarily have to be Sheldon Richardson being on the team, which is why I felt like Sheldon Richardson suddenly became the odd man out. Now, another question that needs to be answered is, was this a bad move, right? Is this ultimately going to be something that the Browns regret? Did the Browns cut somebody they could not sufficiently replace? Now, ultimately, the season is going to bear this out, right? If the interior run issues are still there, that's going to be a huge misstep. But what I can say towards the positive side of this argument is, if you look how this roster is constructed, if you look at the flexibility on the defensive line and the amount of young guys that they have coming into that defensive tackle position, I feel like they are at a better place to make a move like this than they've ever been in the last few years. So this is the time to kind of test that. Richardson's main value was his ability to pass rush. If none of these young guys can pass rush from that defensive tackle position, you still have Malik Jackson, who can do kind of the similar things that Richardson can do. If stopping the run becomes an issue, you could start to move Jadeveon inside more often to kind of plug those issues. So there are significant safety blankets. I think ultimately what's going to make or break this decision in the eyes of fans, or even just in football perspective, is going to be, one, Andrew Billings has to be good this year, right? That justifies a lot if Andrew Billings gets on the field and he's pretty good. But what's really going to decide this is Tommy Togiai or Jordan Elliott or one of the young guys really have to break out and become a starting caliber player this year. I think if that happens, you made the absolute right move. You cleared space for one of these young guys to develop. They develop. Now you have a long-term solution. If none of these young guys pan out and they're all kind of rotational, not starting level players, then this is going to look like a more questionable move. But that's just my thoughts on the whole Sheldon Richardson thing. Now that we know that he's absolutely not coming back to the Browns this year, let me know what you think about the Browns' decision to not keep him. Do you think it's going to be a mistake, or do you think this is going to be something that they're going to find long-term solutions from? Let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. But again, guys, thank you for watching. Have a great day. Have a good night.